James became King of Scotland when his mother Mary fled to England in 1567. He was 1 year old when he was crowned James VI. He grew up learning how to steer a path between religious fanatics and the violent Scottish nobility, and at the same time acquired a serious scholarly education. He was very proud of that. He pleaded for his mother's life, but accepted the fact of her execution by the English Queen Elizabeth. Business was business, and he had no memory of Mary. He'd been taught that she was a Scarlet Woman, and she had, after all, murdered his father and taken a lover. He was the recognized heir to the English crown, and he wasn't going to put that in danger. And so in 1603, when Elizabeth the Virgin Queen eventually died, the oldest monarch England had ever had, he came from Edinburgh to London for his coronation. He was openly bisexual. The word in London was that Elizabeth had been a king, and now they had James the Queen. In Latin, of course. By the accident of heredity, England and Scotland were now united in a single kingdom, Britain. Everyone had high hopes of James, especially the Roman Catholics, who thought that his distaste for bossy Scottish Presbyterians would encourage him to lift Elizabeth's restraints on their worship. They were wrong about that. So a group of well-connected Roman Catholic terrorists planned to blow up the entire political structure at the opening of Parliament in 1605. They brought over an explosives expert from the Low Countries. He organised placing 2.5 tons of gunpowder in a cellar under the Palace of Westminster. It's a sign of how secure England became that for the last 200 years, November the 5th, the anniversary of Guy Fawkes' capture, has been simply an excuse for a fun night of pretty explosions. Today, of course, in the shadow of 9/11, 5/11 has a more chilling resonance. Al-Qaeda terrorism has tainted many people's idea of Muslims, which perhaps makes it easier to understand how Fawkes' terrorism affected people's idea of Roman Catholics. Actually, James himself was more sympathetic to high church than to low, because the followers of Protestant sects did not want priests and bishops to do religion on their behalf. In the Protestant view, the godly man has his own Bible, the devil's agent is a priest with a Catholic prayer book. James felt that people who didn't have respect for hierarchy in church would be equally disrespectful of authority in general. No bishop, no king was his fear. And the authority of the king was very dear to him. He spelled out his ideology in masks, theatrical balls, in his new banqueting house in Whitehall. His intellectual take on the job was that he was God's deputy and that he ruled by divine right as the absolute sovereign power in England. Having been raised in Scotland, he was rather baffled by the idea of common law, the notion that law was in the hearts and minds of the people, expressed through the precedents of the courts and their juries of ordinary folk. But this was the essence of the English system. It had been essential for the Normans to operate that way, as foreign rulers in a land they didn't know, and it had become embedded in the fabric of English life. Henry VIII and Elizabeth had the position of tyrants, but their tyranny required popular consent. They had to be popular in order to rule. James wasn't good at being popular. He was head of a court, a place of factions and favourites, and was grand in a very private way. One example of his sense of power and duty was in his treatment of tobacco. It had been introduced from America by Walter Raleigh, and Elizabeth had felt rather alarmed by it. It made her feel ill. She bet Raleigh that he couldn't weigh the smoke that came out of a pipe. Raleigh knew how to perform. He weighed an ounce of tobacco, smoked it, weighed the ash, and the missing weight was the smoke. Elizabeth laughed and paid up, saying she'd seen men turn their gold into smoke, but this was the first time she'd seen smoke turn to gold. James's whole approach was different. He disliked smoking and felt it was his duty to protect his subjects. But he was a rational man, a teacher, so he wrote a pamphlet, Counterblast to Tobacco, explaining that it was
loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in the black, stinking fume thereof, nearest resembling the horrible Stygian smoke of the pit that is bottomless.
He wanted to persuade people by the force of his argument, so he published it anonymously. Of course, no one took any notice. So, as the wise and kindly father of his people, he banned the growing of tobacco in England and increased the customs duty on tobacco by 4,100%. And reissued the pamphlet with his name on it. His whole approach was based on rational thought, not an English habit, and what he saw as the absolute authority of a king, also rather foreign to them. And his authority was not backed by any army, and his income was too small to run both the court and the government. The regular royal income came from rents on lands, feudal dues, and customs duties. But the flood of gold and silver coming to Europe from the New World had created inflation, reducing the real value of that income. Medieval government was designed for rather static farming economies and vast estates. Towns, run by common folk with special liberties granted in charters, had been useful little add-ons. But now international and intercontinental trade had blossomed. The nobles had declined, the towns had become major financial centres. Inflation, the growth of Protestantism, a lack of respect for traditional authority, the emergence of assertive members of Parliament, none of this was restricted to England. But in England it had a slightly different flavour. Everywhere else the ruler made the law, he was the law, but not in England. Kingship existed under the law. James simply didn't understand this. He was certain that the job of king meant being above the law. And being James, he not only understood this was the problem, but said so as a matter of principle. And when the Lord Chief Justice disagreed, the Lord Chief Justice got the sack. James was, people said, the wisest fool in Christendom. He needed to raise taxes, but taxation was always regarded as a special event. Taxes might be levied if there was an emergency need for cash, but the law said that this could not be done without the agreement of Parliament, which gave the Commons the chance to present demands to him. They expected what was called redress of grievances before granting him supplies, and these were exactly the kind of people who tended to be Puritans, low church, with no real sense of proper deference to people better born than themselves. So he avoided that as much as possible. His way of life didn't help either. His diversions were hunting, an obsession, and pretty young men, another obsession. Right at the start of his reign, he took up with a pretty young Scot who'd been his page. Robert Carr was given the estate of the executed Walter Raleigh and quickly became a viscount and a privy councillor. When Carr decided to wed the married 17-year-old Countess of Essex, who hated her husband, James helped to sort out the divorce. The Countess's family, the Howards, detested Carr but realised this was the best way to get into favour at court. Carr's close friend, Sir Thomas Overbury, tried to warn him off that filthy, base woman, which annoyed the Countess. So the sweet young couple poisoned Sir Thomas, which opened the door eventually to the Howard's enemies, who exposed the murder plot to James, while providing him with another very beautiful young man, George Villiers, to take Carr's place. Carr and his wife were sentenced to death, and Villiers, whose legs were wonderful, became the Duke of Buckingham, and the murderous couple were pardoned. By the time King James died, aged 58, in 1625, the king and the Puritans were set on course for a direct collision, and his son Charles wasn't going to change direction.